After picking up a woman on a snowy, dark road, Paul saw a pair of big eyes, and the last thing he remembered was a loud bang. When he woke up with the weight of a tragedy on his shoulders, a news segment on TV showed him what he must do to redeem himself. Paul was paying attention to the road as he drove away from Phillipsburg, Montana, where he just dropped off a delivery. It started snowing heavily, and his vision was compromised, but he still caught something moving on the side of the pavement. At first, he thought it was an animal, but as he got closer, he realized it was a woman. No, it was a young woman carrying a backpack. Paul's eyes widened. His immediate instinct was to shake his head. He couldn't pick up anyone on his delivery truck. It was against company policy, and he could get in trouble. Paul never broke the rules. His life was perfect because of that. He thought about every move carefully and planned ahead. He had a duty to his company and his job and promised to follow the rules in his contract. But was that duty more important than keeping someone alive? Hey there, what are you doing, lady? How can you walk these roads? It's freezing and dangerous. There's no sidewalk, Paul shouted at her after rolling down the window. I didn't have a choice, Ock. The young woman turned slightly to him, but kept walking. But Paul followed slowly with his truck. What are you planning to do? You're going to freeze to death, he said, alarmed and frustrated. I need to get to the city, she said, rubbing her arm and licking her chapped lips. I'll be fine, unless you give me a ride. She got close to his door when Paul remained quiet and asked again, Hello, can you give me a ride to the city? You're right. It is freezing. It would be a huge help. I don't have any money to pay you, but maybe... The young woman began rambling while Paul thought about it. Ock, get on, Paul said, releasing the locks and watching the girl rush to the passenger side. He started driving as soon as she closed the door and upped the heat so she could get warm. Thank you, sir. I'm Olive, the girl said, sighing in relief as she held her hands to the warm air. Nice to meet you. I'm not supposed to let anyone hitchhike, but that was dangerous. What were you doing out there? Why didn't you take a bus? Paul wondered, still careful while driving. I missed the last bus, and I needed to get back to Anaconda, Olive responded, shrugging. I work part-time at a cafe and study the rest of the time. All right. What were you doing in Phillipsburg? Paul shook his head. My mom lives there. I went to visit her, Olive stated, nodding. She began talking about her life in detail. She was a sweet young woman, making her own way in the city after growing up in a small town. But listening to her stories and responding accordingly had distracted Paul from the road. He was no longer squinting and was driving much faster than earlier. Perhaps he was eager to get this girl to safety and be done with his day, but that made him careless. Until then, his headlights only revealed darkness and the cement road, but a pair of bright eyes appeared unexpectedly right in the middle of the road. Paul jumped, thinking it was a ghost, but Olive yelled, "It's a deer!" And he swerved, trying to avoid the animal. His tires didn't want to follow the steering wheel, and they couldn't find purchase when he hit the brakes. The last thing he remembered was a loud bang, as the truck went directly toward a tree. Paul woke up in a hospital room a day later. He had no family nearby, and a nurse had to explain what had happened. Olive was gone. She had never clicked on her seatbelt, and the impact threw her off the truck. The crash made the news, and he watched attentively from his bed as the reporter showed a picture of Olive and her mother, a woman named Anna. And for the first time in his grown adult life, Paul began to cry. It made the machines go crazy, and the kind nurse tried to calm him down. But it was no use. His manager visited a few days later. Although his boss was sympathetic and said the company would pay the hospital bills, Paul was fired for taking a hitchhiker and getting into such an accident. I'm sorry, Paul. I have to do this. But you can use me as a reference for your next job. I'll tell them how you're a good worker. This is just out of my hands, his manager said, leaving shortly afterward. Paul got out of the hospital after a few more days and went home. He fell into a depressive hole, not leaving his bed for days thinking of the young life that might have been if they hadn't crossed paths. After a few days of wallowing in his own guilt, Paul searched for the news segment he had seen at the hospital. He watched it several times, going back over that night and thinking of what he could do. But after a while, Paul realized he was looking at Olive's mother's face too much. He was apologizing internally to her image on the video. Perhaps she was the answer. He almost couldn't believe he hadn't thought about it again. Reluctantly, he got up from bed and wore nice pants and a clean shirt. He grabbed a good coat, boots, hat, and car keys. Olive had been walking towards the city from a small town of only over 1,000 people. Everyone in these small towns in Montana knew each other, so he was confident about finding her. He wasn't prepared for the intense cold that swept over his body when he drove through the same road, but he pushed through it. He knew the feeling had nothing to do with the weather, but he needed to reach Anna. Paul thought about what he would say to her and how he would make amends. His body calmed down, and he repeated the words several times until he reached the small town. Several people walked around, but Paul stopped in front of a couple with their toddler and asked them for directions. They were nice enough and pointed him toward a couple of houses. "Thank you," he said, trembling as he drove on. He reached a cluster of pretty, typically suburban homes and knocked on the correct house. "Hello," a quiet voice greeted him after slightly opening the door. "Hey," Paul said in a high-pitched tone and stopped. The words he had rehearsed in the car refused to come out. "Sir, I'm not interested in any religion or whatever you're selling," Anna said, tired. "No, wait. Please, I knew your daughter," he blurted, so she wouldn't close the door. Anna's eyebrows wrinkled her forehead, and she opened the door further. "You knew Olive? How?" He stuttered, looking down and shifting his feet. "I worked with her at a cafe." "Oh," Anna said, opening her door fully and stepping closer to Paul. "My name is Paul. She told me she was visiting you, and then I saw the news." "I'm so sorry," Paul started, not knowing how the lie was coming out so easily. But somehow he couldn't tell her the truth despite his shame. "Oh, I see," Anna stated, crossing her arms as she covered her body tighter with her sweater. "I just couldn't live with myself these past few days," Paul continued sadly. "I wanted to come to offer my condolences and my regrets." Anna sighed, looking away and holding her emotions tightly. "You know, I shouldn't have let her visit me or leave that late. She must have missed the bus. Police said she hitchhiked. I should have made her stay one more night," the woman lamented, shaking her head. "No," he hesitated. "I mean, it's not your fault. It could have happened to anyone. Other people do crazy things and are perfectly fine." "Yes, they do," Anna sighed. "Would you like to come in for some coffee? Everyone in this town has known me for too long. They're all treating me like I will break in any second. I won't. I could use some real conversation." Paul was surprised. His hand went immediately to his hat. He removed it and combed his hair nervously. But he couldn't say no to Anna. He would do anything to make amends, especially because he didn't have the courage to tell her the truth. Anna ushered him inside, and he followed. They spent the next couple of hours talking about anything and everything. Anna told him many stories about Olive, even laughing and calling her a rebellious child. "People don't want me to speak so candidly about her. It's like we can't be honest when someone dies, like we can only remember the good things. Obviously, Olive was so beautifully good, but she was a wild kid too," Anna smiled. "That's what I loved and hated about her. I can't be this honest with anyone else." "Thank you, Paul." "You're welcome. I guess it's easier to talk to a stranger." He nodded, smiling. He expected today to be terrible when he got in his car, but it was not like that at all. And aside from lying about his acquaintance with Olive, Paul had been honest about everything else in his life. "Would you like something stronger?" Anna asked out of the blue. Paul froze for a second. "Oh, sure." He nodded rapidly. Surprisingly, Anna produced a tequila bottle, cut up some limes, and placed some salt on the table. Paul was never much of a drinker. He had never even tasted tequila before but followed her lead. After several shots, Anna was laughing and dancing in the middle of her kitchen. She grabbed his hand and forced him to dance, although he had the rhythm of a baby deer on ice. But he was happy from the alcohol and followed along. They got closer and closer as they twirled in the kitchen, and things took a turn Paul never expected. He woke in her bed the next morning with a pounding in his temple, but a feeling of fullness in his chest. Everything was all right in the world. He turned, rustling the sheets and her sleeping form. He had no idea if he could ever tell her the truth about Olive, but he was determined to make her happy. Maybe that would be his redemption. He rushed to his pants on the floor, visited the bathroom for a second, and went directly to the kitchen. She must have been too sad these days to eat much, so Paul grabbed everything and made a full American breakfast of pancakes, eggs, and bacon with orange juice. He even set the table, almost excited. "What's that fantastic smell?" Anna asked as she rounded the corner while tightening her robe. "It's pancakes. They should help with the hangover," Paul greeted with a wide smile. "I'm actually feeling much better. Better than I do these days," she sighed, grinning slightly at him, and reached for a chair. But the doorbell rang. "Sit down." "I'll get it," Paul said, placing a plate in front of her and going to the door. "Thank you. I haven't been treated so great in a long time," Anna said. Paul didn't say anything as he reached the knob, but he knew if she let him, he would treat her like a princess for as long as he could because last night had erased everything for him. It was a reset. His heart was full, and there was no shame. But his heartbeat stopped at the policeman waiting outside. Paul's eyes were frozen wide in pure fear, as if it was a crime to lie and sleep with a woman. Hello?" the policeman asked, his head leaning to one side in confusion. "Yes," Paul said through tight lips. "Oh, Claude," Anna called out, and he heard her chair squeak as she stood. "Paul, this is my friend, Claude." Paul nodded awkwardly. "It's nice to meet you, Officer Claude." "Oh yeah," Claude said, still confused. However, he lifted his belt and cleared his throat. Paul wasn't sure, but it was almost like the man wanted to show him his gun. He stood straighter too, a display of strength, an encounter between male peacocks. But Anna interrupted their standoff. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I wanted to see if you wanted some breakfast," Claude answered, not looking away from Paul. "How about you have breakfast with us?" Paul made pancakes, and there's more than enough, Anna suggested and waved for him to come in. Claude wasn't sure, but he entered the house, closing the door behind him. Anna got him a plate, and they sat down. At first, they chatted, but the policeman commented, "So, Paul, you're not from around here, but I feel like I know you." Before Paul could answer, Anna said, "He's from Anaconda. It's not that far. You might have seen him around." "Oh, interesting," Claude nodded, forking another piece of pancake. They finished breakfast, and the cop left for work. Paul cleaned the dishes and told Anna that he needed to go. "But I would like to see you again if you like. I had a wonderful night," he stated thoughtfully with his heart in his sleeve. Anna looked at him shyly, which was odd considering the outgoing and forward woman from the day before. But she nodded. They kissed at the door, and Paul couldn't wait to see her again. However, as he drove through town trying to reach the road on his way back to the city, a squad car turned on its lights and followed. It was Claude. "Hey there, what's going on? Was I going too fast?" Paul asked, relaxed, considering they'd just had a good time at breakfast. "Oh, you were going too fast, all right. Too fast and loose with Anna. Listen to me, Polly," Claude began, leaning his hands on Paul's windowsill. "You'll stay out of Anna's life from now on, or else." It was a peacock encounter again. However, Paul had no interest in dancing or pecking this man. He only wanted to get home and plan when to see Anna again. "I'm sorry, Officer Claude. What happens between Anna and I is none of your business," he said slowly and carefully. "I don't know where I know you from, but I'll find out. It can't be good. Then I'll make your life a living hell. Do you hear me? Don't come back to Phillipsburg, and don't call Anna again," Claude demanded, almost placing his head inside the car. He also widened his eyes maniacally. Paul stared back, refusing to agree, and Claude grabbed his shirt, bringing their faces closer. "I will end you," he stated and pushed Paul back. Claude stood up and walked back to his car, giving Paul one final threatening look as he drove away. Paul hit his steering wheel in frustration, bruising the sides of his hands. His breath came in and out quickly as he battled his anger, his desire to run to Anna and defy the strange cop. Could testosterone or adrenaline awaken his male instincts to fight for a female? It didn't make sense. He had never felt this primal before, had never had an enemy or been in any fights. But somehow he was alive. He took a deep breath and drove home, knowing he would not listen to Claude. Over the next few days, he called Anna several times from his house, but she dismissed him quickly every time. Perhaps it had been a one-night stand for her. That was perfectly fine. But that's not the impression he got in the morning after the cop left. It felt like she liked him. It was also unfair if she just ghosted or tried to blow him off without any warning. So he drove back to Phillipsburg to see her, almost without thought. "Paul, what are you doing here?" Anna asked after opening her door. She seemed surprised but worried. "Anna, I know you might not be interested in seeing me anymore. Maybe you changed your mind after I left because we're strangers. But Paul began, this time repeating the exact words he had thought about saying during his car to the small town. But Anna shushed him and brought him inside. "You can't be here," she said quietly. "Is there someone here? Are you in danger?" Paul asked just as quietly, but he was already looking around to protect her. "No, there's no one. God, I'm so stupid. I thought he had gotten over it already. I thought we were friends," Anna sighed, almost pulling her head and walking a few steps away from Paul. "What? Claude?" "Yes, he freaked out on me later the day you left. He came here, called me all sorts of names, said I should be mourning my daughter." Anna explained, tears gathering quickly in her eyes. "He was Manic Paul. I was so scared. That's why I've been dodging your calls and everything. I don't know what to do." The formerly analytical Paul, who took a few minutes before deciding to help a girl escape the cold, didn't have to think about anything this time. He blurted out, "Let's run away together. Get out of Montana. Let's go somewhere sunny, like Miami. Start life over." Anna stopped and stared at him. Her hands wiped her tears. "What?" She breathed, almost laughing at the absurdity. "We can't." "Why not?" "We just met." Anna shrugged, but her eyes told another story. She was considering it. "I don't know what ties you have here or what job or if you own this house, but I have nothing. I've had nothing. I know we just met, but I've been asleep until that night with you. I've never danced before, especially to no music in the middle of a kitchen," Paul said, walking closer to her and leaning his head. "I don't want to go back." Anna looked around her house, at her hands when Paul held them, at the pictures of her and Olive on the walls, and something clicked. Paul had come over because of Olive. Perhaps Olive had sent him, somehow, where she was. "It's crazy," she whispered, looking down but not letting go of his hands. "I understand," Paul nodded, defeated. "Let's do it," Anna said unexpectedly. 6 months later. Anna and Paul got married at a Miami courthouse. Their new neighbors, a Latin couple who spoke little English, served as witnesses because they had no one else. She also didn't wear a wedding dress because she thought it was silly for a woman in her late 40s to be in white. She wore a sundress instead to represent her new life in sunny Miami. Paul was over the moon. He adored Anna more than anything in the world and reminded her of it every single day. Sadly, he had to return to work the day after their wedding because they were saving for a honeymoon in Cancun, Mexico. But Anna had the day off. Paul encouraged her to go to a spa and enjoy a walk along the beach. "You deserve it, honey," he told her before leaving, and Anna had no idea how she got so lucky. She did exactly as he said but wanted to be home quickly so she could make him dinner. Anna greeted her building's security guard, grabbed her mail from the walls of mailboxes, and went up the stairs to the first floor while sorting through them. Her keys rattled as she placed them in the locket, but she wasn't looking. Something in her mail had caught her eye. It was a stampless envelope, so she closed the door absent-minded and threw the rest of the letters on the nearby counter. Outside, the envelope read, "My wedding gift." She smiled immediately, thinking Paul had probably placed it in the mailbox to surprise her. Ripping the paper quickly, she braced to see the tickets to their honeymoon or something similar. But it wasn't. There were several papers, including ones with the heading "Police Report." Her eyes traveled quickly through everything, not understanding what was happening, but seeing Paul and Olive's names. It was then she saw something else inside the ripped envelope, a small card with the words, "Love, Claude." She went back to the reports and read the full explanation. It was an accident report from the police station about Olive's death, and Paul's name was there. He was the driver, she uttered as everything sunk in. Her body violently spazzed, and Anna held her stomach as she ran to the nearest sink, emptying everything. When she was done, a tortured, broken scream ripped from her chest, rattling the windows of her new Miami home. What can we learn from this story? Don't make impulsive decisions. While being spontaneous is all right, you should never make decisions without thinking about them thoroughly, especially regarding people you've just met. The truth will always come out, no matter how long it takes. Paul lied and pretended. He escaped his old life as if the truth wouldn't follow him or come out eventually.